Tab navigation's become almost ubiquitous on the web and really popularised by sites such as Amazon. So this is amazon.co.uk, and now we've got a range of probably 10 tabs across the top.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I remember back in the early days of Amazon, they started out with tab navigation very early on. And there was a period of time where they kept adding stores or areas to their site as it grew. Where if there's ever a case for organic growth syndrome in websites, Amazon has had so many years to evolve. There was one point where they probably were 4 or 5 rows of tabs deep. And it was becoming a web design joke, how all web designers would get the joke, how deep these tabs on Amazon were going.
Where would they be in 5 years?
Yeah,
a whole screen full of tabs.
Screen full of tabs.
Well, Amazon.com has gone a little way in terms of simplifying the whole tab metaphor now.
Yeah, right. They see all 32 product categories into one. But yes, it looks a lot better and cleaner, obviously. While tab navigation is obviously a very intuitive way to design, a little bit of planning goes a long way.
I'm not quite so sure who said it, but I think somebody said that it was Leonardo da Vinci that invented tabs. So how true that is, I don't know. It's still a very popular way of denoting. It's a very intuitive interface, the tab interface. It's often misused and misinterpreted, but it's still a very, very powerful metaphor. And in a lot of different sites, right the way from personal sites such as this, I particularly like the Pixel Panic, where we have that just a subtle little bounce on the hover state.
The colours are great on that site too.
Colours are fantastic. Yeah. And also over to Mozilla, the home of Firefox and Thunderbird. And here, again, it's just a very subtle colour change. I think they could probably have done something slightly different with that.
Still very nice, very clean, for sure, and easy to manage, which is, of course, one of the advantages of CSS that we always like to refer to.
Well, if we go back to amazon.co.uk, it's interesting to see that these tabs are actually made of graphics.
Yep.
So the text is embedded in the graphics. I'm not quite sure what that font is. It looks a little bit like Arial. So
yeah.
Like we don't have Arial installed on our computers today.
Exactly.
But far better that we can use CSS to style unordered lists.
Right. To style the tab navigation, because in a situation like this, actually, why don't you outline the table and table cells, and let's get a look at what those tabs look like in Amazon, and that would be under outline.
Are you ready for this, if we outline table cells?
I'm ready for it. I can handle it.
Oh,
yeah.
My goodness me.
Yeah. Outline the tables, too. Just let's take a look at that. And we can see here how the entire header there is in a table of its own. And then you have the cells individually holding the graphics, which are then linked. And as you can imagine, this is really a very difficult site for somebody who's not getting to it with a traditional screen.
If you don't mind, I'm just going to use the View Rendered Source extension, which is available for Firefox. I do hope you're ready for this. Let's scroll down and try and find the HTML for that particular area.
Yeah, that's very complex. When you're seeing all those dots and lines and outlines, you're looking at the structure that the table-based layouts have used to create this. And as you can see, this goes to the heart of the matter with the way we approach something CSS versus older-fashioned way of doing things. Obviously, a lot more code, a lot more hurdles for assistive devices, and certainly if we were trying to send this information to an alternative device, it would be very difficult. Whereas even with the tab navigation, we can send that with CSS, because if we're styling it in CSS, it's still that semantic markup. So when it gets to an alternative device, such as a cell phone, it doesn't look like a tab, but it's still a list of links.
Well, designer Doug Bowman was responsible for some of the best innovation in using CSS to style tab navigation from unordered lists. And over on A List Apart magazine, a reminder that all of the bookmarks are available in the bookmarks.html file. But here we can see one of Doug's early examples from A List Apart. And here we've got a tab navigation, which is actually made of 2 graphic files. Nice thing about this, which of course is something that Amazon itself with its image navigation doesn't do, is that the text is completely fluid.
Right. If you need the bigger text, as I do these days, to see, then you can just, everything moves with it. And as you can see there, the graphics are only, in the tabs, are only creating the visual enhancement. They are not interfering with the actual text.
Let's turn off the CSS and just put our money where our mouth is and see whether that is, in fact, an unordered list. Whoa, I think I need to Whoops. Drop that down. Turn the CSS off and have a look at the source. A little bit of CSS going on in there. But we have a very plain unordered list.
Pretty amazing.
So let's have a look at what we're going to do for this exercise. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you how the navigation has been developed for the example site, the example worrisome.com page that we've been building and using and developing elements for throughout this title. So I'm going to flip over into Dreamweaver, which I'm using as my text editor. And here, what I've done is I've created just a straightforward unordered list. So I've given the unordered list its own unique ID because in this particular instance it's not inside any other parent container such as a div. I want to use the ID to target that list specifically and not other lists that appear on the page. I'm also going to be using an image replacement technique, which we learnt about in earlier chapters. And for that purpose, I've added an additional ID to each one of the list items. Notice also that I've used a title attribute on the list item, although it could just as easily have gone on the anchor itself.
Title attributes are useful also in extending the meaning of things for people who have, let's say, learning disabilities or need additional information to describe what it is that they're looking at.
So let's start by adding some style. Up inside my style element, I'm going to apply some style to the list, to the unordered list, which I gave the ID of navmain to earlier on, and you'll start to see some familiar rules cropping up. I've removed the default markers with list style type none, and I've also given the UL a width and a height, zeroed out its margin and its padding, and applied a background image. One of the rules which you may not be familiar with at this point is the position relative, and we're going to be covering positioning in Chapter 10. I've used position relative here to establish a positioning context for other items which are going to appear when inside that list a little bit later on. First of all, let's take a look at that in the browser. So I'm going to save the file and preview that in my browser, Firefox. And here we can see that I've got a background image which is spread across the unordered list, but it's still not particularly attractive, and the list items themselves are still running down the page rather than across it. Unlike the earlier example, I'm going to start using positioning to add the graphical elements to the list. Each one of these list items has been given its own ID. And notice here that I'm using positioning absolute, and we are going to be covering more on positioning in later chapters. I've positioned this list item 1 pixel from the top of the list and 230 pixels from the left. It's been given a specific width and height and its own background image. I'm now going to add similar rules for the other 2 items in the list.
And essentially the only difference here is where the actual tabs are being positioned, correct?
There are 2 things actually going on in here. First of all, we're using a slightly different position. So for example, here this is position left 330 pixels, as opposed to the first item, which is 230. But the next trick that I want to show you involves the background position itself. So notice here that each one of the background images, it's the same image that I'm using. It's the li navmain PNG, but I'm actually using background positioning to move that background into different positions. And we can have a look at that, show you that image. So, let's save the file, switch over into Firefox, and refresh the page. And now we can see the list start taking shape. I'm using the image replacement technique, and here we can see that the regular text is still sitting over the top of the background images that we've applied to the list item. So we can go ahead and fix that by applying one simple rule to the anchors. I notice here that I've again used display block to make the whole of the region clickable. I've added a specific width and height just to ensure that all browsers reliably size the clickable area, and moved the text off screen, indented it left 9,999 pixels in the usual way. I've also used overflow hidden. So let's save that file, dive over into Firefox and refresh, and now we can see that the list has really taken shape. If we want to add a little bit of interactivity, we can use our old friend, the hover state. Now I've combined all rules for the hover states for each of the 3 list items into one snippet. And notice here that the hover state is using, again, exactly the same image as the link state. However, what I'm doing is I'm repositioning that anchor by using negative positioning to move it up and left to give the impression that there is more than one image being swapped out. So if I save that file, back over into the browser and refresh, now we have our rollover state with our title attribute popping up as a tooltip.